I'm not sure that's a good idea. Yep. Zurich, or who is Zurich?
We'll pass it between us then. That's all right. And then we can give it to Maggie when she comes up to read. So, oh yes, absolutely. So, where do you want us?
I'm going to just.
Should we do? Okay.
Can I just do a quick introduction? Okay, welcome everyone. I hope we've got some people tuning in from all over the world. We are in the middle of nowhere, but we have a fantastic collection of people here. The idea really is that some of the local problems can go global, and that we can create networks where everyone is able to discuss the local problems that they have. Now, divided we fall, united we stand. Everyone has issues that they are not getting a voice for. So what we're trying to do with this event is create a community of people to go forward with looking after our humanness. So I'm very proud to announce that we have Katya Meier here with Karen Robinson of the Sunday Times. Katya has written a fantastic book, and she will now discuss it. So here we go.
Thank you, Charlotte, for having us.
Well, hello everyone, and I'm Karen Robinson from the Sunday Times newspaper, and I'm here today to talk to Katya Meier, the author of Across the Big Blue Sea. Wonderful book, a uniquely up close and personal view of what's called the refugee crisis in Italy. This is a memoir of her year working in a small refugee home in a Tuscan hill village, and the young Nigerian women she encountered there: Fola, Joyce, Hope, Precious, and Izogi, later joined by Rita and Ida. Now, this book has had some amazing reviews, quite justifiably. Perfectly done, with so much humor and outrage both, said Lauren Collins in The New Yorker. The book is important and illuminating, according to Angela Ledgerwood of Esquire magazine. Just two of the reviews that praised its clear-sighted honesty, humor, and empathy. And so, Katya, the events in the book happened between 2014 and 2015. So has anything changed since then?
Okay, yes, a lot of things have changed. Just to give you a quick overview of the numbers, when I started working at the refugee home here in the Tuscan hinterland in 2014, probably 160,000 people arrived across the Mediterranean. So the moment I got on, they cut me off. That's not a good sign. The world doesn't want to hear me. Okay. But the situation is totally in a span of 10 years, we have gone from very few people arriving, and then maybe during the Arab Spring, 60,000 people arriving, and then the numbers were down again. And then 2014 and 15, that's why the refugees homes were opened in places like here, where you'd never expect to have. You have hotels and castles, but not refugee homes. So people arrived here too, and now, of course, the political situation has changed and things are very different.
what you call the Tuscan outback?
Yeah, that's a good question. I've been here for 20 years. And as it goes, when you're a migrant, you sort of, especially a penniless migrant like I was, I mean, a fortunate one because I have a Swiss passport. So even though 20 years ago, Switzerland isn't part of the European Union, so I was actually supposed to go back home at some point, but then the Italian bureaucracy messed up, so I was able to stay. I can get the Brits out there in the world some advice in the future about how to do that. But basically, I didn't have any funds, and so I started to do what you do. I did picked olives and realized, wow, that's much harder than I thought it would be, and did many other things, even wedding planning at some point, which if you want to get out of theater and then you end up planning weddings is like not, that's like a total mistake. So I realized that it's far too much drama. And then, and then I did many other things. My Tuscan partner who's here, his brother always says to him, even after all these years, he says, so you got together with a Swiss woman and you managed to find the only one without any money. Sort of how stupid can you be? But anyway, so that's his, that's his destiny anyway. So what happened is that I got into tourism a bit and writing and many things that didn't pay too well. And then one of the jobs I had as a sort of part-time job was in a women's shelter, because for a women's shelter, the shelter opened to give home to women and children who had to leave their families because of domestic violence. And of course, it's quite a good place if you have to change identity. In the Tuscan hinterland, it's not so easy to be found. So I worked there. And when the numbers started to rise in Sicily, the arrivals sort of were booming. Like from 2012, there were maybe 13,000, and then you suddenly have 10 times as many people arriving. You need to make sure they have a roof over their head and they have a bed to sleep in. And Italy did quite a good thing then, quite a clever thing. They worked locally with structures that, like empty hotels, empty schools. They knew there were places where people could sleep to avoid having people in big sort of camps or, there are some of them in Sicily and they're horribly run and they create a whole sort of parallel society that's really hard to sort of live in or manage. And so the idea was to have all these local small structures in the hinterland where migrants and refugees who had come over the Mediterranean would have time for 6 months to sort of, to apply for residency or refugee status and then go on from there.
Right, and this is how these young women came into your life. And we're going to hear a passage from your book to show just how far they came into your life. And we're lucky enough to have with us today Maggie Meier, a Kenyan Maasai actor, female rights activist and social entrepreneur. And she's here in Potentino for the Castello di Potentino Frontline Club Symposium with her husband Nelson, and they're going to talk about their projects in conservation and tourism and social change. But before that happens, she's agreed to read for us from Katya's book. So Maggie.
In the early hours of the last warm August night of 2014, I was sitting in our Dacia station wagon with my Italian partners, wearing a wig made from a pink tutu. Our two preteen children still wide awake at 2 in the morning, and 5 young women from southern Nigeria, all of them drunk to varying degrees. The Odyssey had been the theme of the costume party we had just attended, an apt one considering our African guest had crossed the Mediterranean Sea on a decrypted boat only a few weeks before. Fola occupied the front seat next to Sergio, and I reached out from the middle row to squeeze an old shopping bag under her chin. At 23, she was the oldest and most inebriated of our Nigerian passengers. Her four friends were still sober enough to yell at her, and so was Sergio. Or was he shouting at me for having gotten him into the situation of the first place? It was hard to tell in a seven-seater car filled beyond capacity with the rambunctious citizens of the world's two most vociferous nations. I'm sorry, Mom, Fola said. It's okay. Don't worry, Mom. Fola, don't turn around. Look at the bag. The bag. Look at the bag. The voices of the dasher had morphed into a sudden chorus to remind Fola of her most important task, to aim for the bag. Her first outburst of projectile vomiting had hit my pashmina shawl towards midnight at the party. Friends had signaled from the dance floor until I realized that I had intervened. I had to intervene. Fola was tall and stout, and it wasn't easy to steer her to the deck chair near the pool. She crashed onto it, fell asleep right away. Sergio had refused to drive her up the hill to the refugee home, and I had drunk too much to do myself. I left her in her alcohol-induced stupor on the roof tonight. Surrounded by inebriated Greek heroes and exuberant Olympian goddesses, I danced to two more tunes before I went back to wrap my pashmina shawl around Fola's shoulders. A cloud of humidity had enveloped the Green Valley, and Sergio was worried she might catch a cold, or worse yet, a congestion, a party crushing ailment onto Italians. When I touched her lightly, she leaned forward, opened her mouth, and expelled a mass of half-digested pasta, birthday cake, and local red wine. I studied the new pattern on my Indian shawl and understood why Sergio hadn't wanted to drive off with her right away. A youth spent partying in Tuscan village, Baz had taught him better. I had used the pashmina as a headcloth in my costume's interpretation of Cassandra during the early hours of the party. Unlike the Trojan Sea, I wasn't predicting the future that night, but contemplating to near past and wondering how things had gotten out of hand so quickly.
There are young women. Where did they come from? What were you expecting? And what did you get?
So when I was asked whether I'd take on the job, it really wasn't, it was because I worked at the shelter that then was turned into a refugee home, and I was the only person speaking any English. And I was aware that I wasn't well prepared for the job, but a lot of people in Italy at that point weren't well prepared for those jobs. Just sort of have to step, you know, you were watching the news every day, what was going on. So it felt like, of course, you need to step up and do this. But there was a whole backstory I wasn't aware of, or rather naively, I was thinking, okay, young women arrive and they're running from a war or you know, there was a civil war in Nigeria, the Boko Haram war, and only slowly did I realize that things are a bit more complicated than that, and that there might be other reasons why the girls were here or came to Italy, and so very quickly it became much more complicated than I had anticipated, and my whole sort of the Hollywood film ideas we have of how that works when you take on a refugee home and you all sit around singing Kumbaya, that wasn't what happened.
No, it certainly wasn't, was it? And you give yourself a very hard time in this book about your liberal assumptions, and I think you're very hard on yourself. As it slowly dawns, you realize that, as you say, they're not all going to sit around singing Kumbaya. But although in a way that's what was the genesis of the book, because you started to write a diary. So tell us about that. Your plans for that didn't really work out.
Yeah, so that's a good example of my first approach. There are projects or interested in, and then of course that was very short-sighted, because what happens if often to refugees, or if you've been to trauma, is actually you do not want to talk about it. It's the last thing you want to do is sit around like I do now and share your story. You sort of want to get on with life and leave that behind. So it was clear that they wouldn't write down their stories or tell their stories, or their stories were very fractured anyway, because lots of things they couldn't tell, also out of whatever legal reasons, etc. So it wasn't easy to find out what actually had happened. So I was, but I sort of had the need to go, to sort of go somewhere with this. I started to take notes at some point. I thought, um, you know, like in this big tsunami wave, and I thought, okay, let's just sort of try on to hold to hold, hold on to a few things, and then you maybe this for something in the future.
So here are these young women from
But then again, coming from Kenya, it's interesting because in our country, we have entire townships which are, we have many people from Italy, for example. Like if you go to Malindi, there, or Watamu, in the Kenyan coast, most of the local people hardly speak any word of English, but they speak Italian, they speak Swahili, and then you wonder what is happening. How come that some people are willing to risk their lives to come into Europe and others are actually coming back home? So I think this is a question of balance. How do we work better? How do we work? How do we cooperate and actually create opportunities across? Because it looks like there are opportunities in Africa, there are opportunities in Europe. How do we create balance so that people don't have to risk their lives to come here? So that, we can have opportunities for Italians to go to Nigeria, to go to Ghana, as much as we could have opportunities for Africans to come into the European nations. Yeah, but thank you so much for this story. I'm really eager now to read this book and to learn more about this, which I've just been reading in newspapers and that. But thank you so much. It's very interesting to hear it from someone who is working with people who are crossing over from Africa into this part of the world. And thank you, Charlotte, for making this kind of possibility for us to come here and actually discuss this and see where is the opportunity for us to work together for for this. Yeah.
So I would like to ask, what do you think could be done better for integration?
It's really interesting what's happening at the moment because I looked up Sejano, people coming here. Sejano has about 70% foreigners at the moment. Xinjiang is 20%. Milan, you'd think, but they're 90%. So something's happening. If I was an anthropologist, I would study what's going on here at the moment. And what's interesting is in the small communities, because what happens, of course, in bigger communities, like in Rato, where there's a huge Chinatown, the moment you have a lot of people from different nations coming in, that's what I live, the Italians, I became friends with daughters of the Italians who, but the Italians themselves didn't integrate, so the second generation started to integrate. But here, because we're smaller communities, you can't sort of just live in your whatever, you still have to connect, and so it's interesting for me, especially at the schools, what's happening. What does that mean? My kids, I think my daughter, there are maybe 12 kids in the class, and 8 out of them are foreigners, or one parent is a foreigner. And so it's like a sort of social experiment, but nobody is watching music. And that it creates fear, of course. So we have to deal with that. The elections and all of that. But we should also sort of see it, I think, as a. I think what we shouldn't do, what we need to do is talk about it, because what happens in regard to integration is this great book in Germany that was written by German sociologist. His background is Syrian. His family came to Germany in the 70s, and he talks about the integration. What's it called? I'm sorry, forget the title. I can give it to you later otherwise. But it's about the fact that we have this expectation still somehow that integration is a smooth, nice process. But actually, it's conflict. It's about having suddenly on a table where we had for hundreds of years just white men discussing everybody's fate. Suddenly you have women, of course, and you have people of color, and you have people with totally different backgrounds, with homosexuals and whatever. You have everybody at the table, and of course that creates a lot of conflict. The conflict is negative. It's just we have to figure out things again, and this wanting to go back to have just, that's what's happening at that moment, just having one person deciding for everybody because it's easier. That's sort of, I think, a reaction to that, the one strong man that we don't. But whereas actually we need sort of have to have the guts to have these conversations, and they're uncomfortable conversations often, I think, because, and that's, I say that as somebody who's coming from the left and aware that sometimes we're sort of too shy about, whatever, don't want to hurt anybody's feelings, etc. But instead it's sort of have to be a bit more courageous about that and sort of try and figure out what's working, what is not working. And not expecting it somehow to be or keep giving out this message, but it's all lovely and wonderful. Of course, it's not. Life is never lovely and wonderful. It's always a mess, and you sort of have to, go out there and discuss it.
I guess I have to be a little bit more negative than that. I come from the States, and we have friggin' Trump.
Yeah.
The Brexit vote is based on racism. It's based on racism. And so what can you say based on your experience with people who are afraid of the new immigration? Because they are. They're ignorant, but they're afraid.
And I think that fear, I mean, of course, in the Italian system, one of my Nigerian colleagues, she's in a very difficult situation. Again, the racism is systemic in the system, and absolutely. I think what doesn't help is sort of we sort of have to listen, because I in big book discussions, I get a lot of people suddenly, sort of left wing voters saying, yeah, but I was sort of thinking too whatever said, and so I think what the populists are doing so well is they have encouraged to voice fears. A lot of people down maybe have a little bit, because the way the world is changing, and of course we're worried about losing our privilege, and there's lots of things going on. So that's where we're giving away all the power in a way, because if we need to be able to sit with somebody and tell and say, so what are you afraid of, and what is it? And then often that fear sort of boils down. It isn't quite as tragic, but if that person isn't
we have a positive story to tell.
You know, and I think the problem is we need to, that you need to protect all these rights we fought for so hard, but nevertheless you also have to have uncomfortable conversations. And one of the things I can tell you from the book is that when I was traveling with Ida, because we was on the boat, and I decided to get to her cousin, and we had got the train ticket there, we traveled, and while traveling we talked about Gambia, the dictator they had there, and she's a terrible man, and blah blah, and I said at some point, yeah, God, and the thing he did about gay people, and Ida said, yeah, but maybe about that one he was right. There I was, that's what I mean. It's never easy. It's never a happy end. I mean, it sounds great, but my best friend is gay, and I'm just going to say, yeah. I mean, of course we had that discussion, and all the public Italian boss with Italian stuff, and said, I can't accept that. I can't accept that, and that's where it gets uncomfortable. That's the moment, and that's I think where we have to have these discussions too. We have, and that's. And if we don't, repeat myself.
I mean, I guess I probably fall on the left, just being, I'm Canadian, so that makes me. But maybe we think too much of one axis, our side and their side, left and right. I mean, there's also a possibility. I'm not saying this is set up. Another way of thinking about this is two complex sets of goods that are competing with one another, because certainly in the 21st century, diversity and inclusion is an incredibly important good, and unless we find, I think what you're talking about, the guts and the competency to be able to manage it, we're going to be very deep shit. On the other hand, and one of the things we're also here talking about is cultural identity, integrity, preservation of ways of life. And so some of the communities that I know and some that I'm involved in are fighting desperately for the maintenance of a kind of cultural integrity where, so I'll say, Indigenous communities in Canada, for the left in Canada, progressives in Canada, diversity is it is really the watchword of our faith. But for some Indigenous communities, diversity is that's not the fight that we're fighting. We have, where all of the forces of the 20th and early 21st century have been working against the preservation of the thing upon which our lives depend. So why do we think that, and we can sympathize with some groups of people when we think that they're trying to preserve their identity, and in other groups we say, well, unless you buy into inclusion and diversity, you're not one of us. Yeah. So I think that we have actually an intersection of various trends of our time that need a great deal of thinking. I'm uncomfortable thinking that it's just our. Suddenly this valley where, took in a whole bunch of people out of a sense of humanity, and yet what those human beings wanted to do here was very different from what you wanted to do. These are complicated things.
Yeah, I have cannons for that.
Okay, so how does that make you right? And there are lots of people in the middle of Idaho who unfortunately have armed themselves with cannons because that's what.
And we find out cannons, right?
And then we've got your knife.
Oh, yeah, it is.
We have that to protect us. But what was did you have a lot of confrontation with the local authorities about what you were doing?
Yes, no, there was, that's in the book. I mean, it's a stereotype of the badly working bureaucracy, the sleazy guy, whatever, the sort of the immigration officer being just not a nice human, like really not. And then,
but you found ways, you realised that you had to work around the system, not confront it.
Yeah,
and that's
which
the
is
best thing
people
can do,
yeah,
isn't it? To get the day-to-day working.
But then on the other hand, there was like the vice prefecto. It was great. I mean, he really tried. Sometimes his hands were tied, but he really tried to help. And definitely also sometimes the experience was what people say they think is not necessarily what they'll do then. So about, talking about politics and things, sometimes I was surprised by people who had the humanity to help, and even though I know they wrote very differently from me. So it's also true, and people I was sure I could count on her because she's saying on Facebook all the time, world peace and whatever. And the moment you ask, there's a big silence. We all have our lives, and it's always complicated. I'm the first one to know that. But so that was interesting too, so that it is not as black and white often. It's if you're in such an extreme situation, it's like, wow, lots of things happened that I didn't expect from people also here, from the officials, but also from the locals in many ways.
Is it still running, the refugee centre?
So not the female refugee home, because it was all left, and then there was at some point much more migration male. They needed more places for male migrants and refugees. The one I won't say the name because I have to change the name, but where I worked at now is closed. There's still a few around, but not that many, of course, anymore, because the numbers have dropped heavily.
Is there financial profit made in this?
Yeah. People here who are out of jobs, and it's sort of becoming a business system. You sort of still pretend it's all, but it's really like a hospital. Of course, people have to be paid, and nobody expects a doctor to sort of do things for free. So it's right that these people are paid, but the whole sort of sense of caritas it's a weird mix. And so at some point I had with the girls when I was desperate that this is all not working what we're doing here, and I was talking to the organization and they had no interest to change anything because the way they get paid is by presence in the refugee home. Wow. So you get those get blah blah. Of course, the 30 or 35 euros go to the structure, and then they give €2.50 to the person in structure and use everything. And if you use that a bit well, you know, there are a lot of hotels that, you know, and you have it 12 months. So they had no interest at some point to lose the presence of those girls, even though I was thinking they need to be in all places. And, you know, I mean, it's not a nice story, it's in the book, but I can see where they're coming from, you know. They suddenly had hired these people, and they suddenly had a working business. And also, they were financing other sort of projects in the city, good projects at some point, you know.
But in general, the money and the funds that were designated by the European Community for national government, do you believe that there are some areas that are using well those monies, or because before, I think there was many mistakes and many misusing, I don't know if it's correct, of the amount of money designated, and when the money were finished, the crime or mafia management of humans and human world started. So that, what do
you mean the money that the Europeans
was big amount of money at the beginning, and doing well things and structuring.
Yeah, but that's where really the mafia got in also, not because they realized that there was money coming. Yeah.
But as far as you know, being in the field, have you seen some areas or realities in which they go to school, they learn Italian, I mean, at least to learn a profession, or be,
you know, expect. The other day, there's a Chianciano Terme, it's a huge German town on the Umbrian border. It's a huge sort of town that boomed in the 60s. It's a sort of ghost town now. It's quite I know. And of course, that's where a lot of refugee homes opened up, because there were all these hotels that weren't really working. Then you have a hotel, and then the state sends, okay, so let's just put a lot of refugees in there. And a lot of shady things happened there. But like recently, I was there, and I was sort of going through a junk shop, and I found these folding chairs which were great, and I wanted to take them home. And then a young guy turned out he was from Ghana, told me, no, I already bought them. And I said, okay, would you sell them? No, my brother saw them, he wants them, can't sell them. And then he put them back under a huge there was like a huge mountain of furniture. I was like, your brother's buying all of this? He said, yeah. Then where's he living? What's he sort of living? No, it all goes to Ghana. We're sending all of this furniture to Ghana. Really? And I was like, chair, at least one chair. And then anyways, no, it's all book. And then because the junk shop, or whatever you call it, is a Rigattier is out of town, so he needed a lift back into town. And I said, yeah, of course, I'm fine if you live. He was with a young guy from Pakistan. They had been in a refugee home together, and so I gave him a lift. And sort of jokingly said, "But if I give you a lift, you have to give me the chair. You sell it." And he said, "No, you can have it. Yeah." So I had the chair. I said, "Oh, but it's not going to go. It's standing on my terrace now." And but what was interesting was that I've been in touch with him a bit. He thought it's being empty, the old furniture that we shipped down, and it's sort of crazy because you can imagine. So it's not great furniture. I mean, there's some nice pieces, but the ship is so expensive, but they're able to make a profit on that. And so what I think is interesting is sort of, he also has a job in a pizzeria, but there are these sort of stories where people invent things or come up with things that you sort of, that's not on the list of if you run a refugee. So this person will go in agriculture and this, and then actually there is sort of sense of, how do you call it? But somebody goes, oh, okay, let's see, can we, many of these projects won't work because it's too complicated, blah, 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 blah. But that I think is interesting to sort of, watch what people are coming up with.
And there's a complete reversal
a reversal of you know what you would imagine. So buying up cheap hotel furniture initially and sending it back to Ghana.
Yeah, no, you know, sort of and that's out with, you know, the middle class white woman who thinks she can tell a few Nigerian girls how to live their life, and that was not useful because they have totally different resources than I have. They have, you know, I things I think they should have, they don't, but they have things I couldn't read and write. And in Grosseto, I always lose my way in Grosseto, it all looks the same to me. And we were once at the Questura together, and she showed me afterwards how to get to the Questura, because of course, not being able to read and write, she had developed a much better sense of orientation than I had. And so my sort of approach failed a lot because I couldn't see these things, and so a lot of those, you know, the girl Hope I talked about before, God, we had arguments about the Italian lessons, and then she leaves, she had to leave, something happened, she was actually kicked out of the home, and now we text only in Italian, we don't speak in English anymore, because once out in the world, she just made it happen. She learned Italian. But in the depression, when you're in a refugee home, the worst thing is the sort of depression that kicks in. It's like you're not, you know, you're not allowed to work. You're waiting for your papers. You at some point maybe you're allowed to work, but you can't find a job and you're not motivated. It's like you know, that would happen to all of us. It's just sort of super depressing. And then the moment she was out in life, you know, she felt the whole thing kicked in again. She such a bright young woman, she learned Italian in no time, but not the way I had set it up, you know, with the lessons and the whole material ready to sort of,
Well, I'm just, so living in Italy, there is quite an interesting simulator for immigration. Immigration will not stop. Nomadism has been part of the human life since all the time, so we're not going back or going forward. It's just going to be in flux continuously like this. What I think is essential here in this country, because we are right in the Mediterranean Sea and everybody's coming from this side, is to kind of legalize how people move from North Africa to Italy. It's very simple. And I think it's because there's so many interests from the state, first of all. There's interested in keeping all the situation really a messy situation, because so they can control the fear. When you bring fear, Trump is the super example.
White trash is much worse than drunk Mexican, honestly. Sure. You know, white trash is completely madness. I grew up in America too, and you know, the level of education of that country is so low that it's ridiculous. So I don't want, you know, and here we have a really interesting place, because first of all, Italy never existed. We were a country in 1861, right? Before we were millions of different countries with millions of different language and millions of different dialect. We didn't like each other at all, right? So we are like, excuse me?
Maybe still like
it's pretty much still like this, but we survive as a community. Same thing that Europe. Europe is pretty much the same. Italians don't really like the French, and the French don't really like the Germans. But pretty much because of the common good, and because we realized that it was much better to be united than one against the other, we decided, even if they try to separate us now, but pretty much that's what happens. Now, I think if we want to talk about migration, we should, as like growing human being, we should start trying to figure out some ideas, you know. For example, if we have boats with €5 each that brings people in Sicily, in Calabria, and wherever you like, then you divide the people and you understand who's coming in with papers and name. Not that, you know that everybody that doesn't speak Italian is born the 1st of January. You know how many people are born the 1st of January between the migrations? All the migrants are born the 1st of January.
Not based. So not much.
You don't even have an identity. Yeah, no. You're called in a certain way because they don't know when they're born. Yeah. No, they don't know. People are coming from Africa. They don't know, having no education because.
In the fight for disabilities. He was a man with cerebral palsy. I don't know how to say that in Italian. He was a very disabled man and a great warrior. One day we were driving, and you could hardly understand when he spoke because his voice was very palsied. And he said, "You know, Rick, people like you like to feel sorry for people like me. You can take your pity and shove it up your ass." And he had such an effect on me. And every year I call him and I say, "Ethan, you're still the son of a bitch who I think I have to answer to for everything I think." But that challenge of those ideas, and I think that as we're moving into a very complex time in the world, that we who are naturally believe in a more humane world and will fight for it, have to think hard also about the attitudes that we have and where we think power really is. And I applaud you for your, I think it's very brave what you've done to question those attitudes yourself. So I just want to say thank you.
Book around the place. So
Can we buy it?
yes, absolutely. Well, they're here. And you do a signing. You could
Books.
But really,
I think the cost is quite first, but that because
it would be difficult to get an Italian version.
it's in, well, I think
just in English, there's somebody working on Italian translation, but that.
No, I'm reading English, I can read English.
I'd love to, if you read it, let me know, because I think we have a lot to discuss.
I think it would be worth everyone's while to read it. It's a magnificent achievement. It's come out of, the reluctant author who never wanted to write a book, but you've done it now. You're now a spokesman for a lot of values, a lot of truths that you've been able to tell people. So it's been a great pleasure to meet you and hear from you. And
Thank you. Karen and Charlotte for having us, and everybody who listened.
we had what luxury all that time. But that's because we're a symposium. So
I'd like to know what's out in the world now. This weird sort of moments of.
So how much?
So would I like to know what's happening. I don't know. It was an interesting test. We've recorded it.
So we can send it afterwards.
So it will be up. Bits of it are up in different parts. We did have a few technical problems, which I'm blaming Alexander for.
Okay.
No, we have some bandwidth issues and some others, but I think we're getting there.
But we have recorded it also, it will go on to YouTube, etc. So I think we'll be able to.
Oh no, absolutely.
Sorry about that. It was quite ambitious thinking that we would be able to get this right the first evening, obviously. However, I do think these discussions are so interesting, and my real purpose for putting all of you together is really because you're such big, interesting brains, and these are really important conversations that we're having. So, in a sense, everyone, these are seeds. These conversations are seeds for people who are going to go out and sow them, make connections, and keep these relationships going, influence each other with your ideas, exactly what really we all need to be doing. So I'm very pleased to see that Wolfgang has got here, because he is actually going to talk to us about the recent history of migrants in Italy. So I think this is going to be a rather bombshell, because I think some of the things that we discussed earlier are really very interesting. So I'm sorry you missed Katya's discussion, but you can read her book, which is time for you. And we've also had very interesting contribution from Daniela, who actually has got some really interesting solutions to discuss about, to look at for dealing with this problem.